I don't want to take your time, so let's start with Professor Javier with his presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so for the last pricing session. Right, so happy to be here. Let me start by thanking the organizers for putting our paper on the program. This is entitled Firm-to-Firm Price Rigidity Within a Network. The title has been subject to change recently. This is joined with Álvaro Castillo, Luis Felipe Céspedes, Jorge Miranda, and myself. Luis Felipe is at the Central Bank of Chile, and Jorge is at the AMF, so the usual disclaimer applies. Okay, so the motivation for the paper starts with the fact that there's a lot of evidence about price stickiness and mostly heterogeneity at the price stickiness level, which has been proven important for the transmission of any type of shock. Think about a cost push shock, a demand shock, and there have been several papers studying the role of this heterogeneity in the price stickiness to understand how quickly shocks propagate throughout the economy. Okay, and this is a very well-known fact. Okay. And typically, the evidence tells you that, well, the rate or the sluggishness by which prices respond to the shocks is actually disciplined on firm-specific characteristics. So think about how this is connected to firms offering different type of products or multi-product firms, the degree of competitiveness in the market, how different are the sectors, not only in terms of the production, also in terms of the price stickiness that I was just mentioning, the amount of linkages that a firm in a specific sector can form relative to other firms, etc. Okay, and I don't need to convince you that, well, firms operate in a very, very complex production chain with different sellers and different buyers offering different types of products. And what we're going to ask here is how the specific match between suppliers and buyers affect their price adjustment decisions, okay? And this is actually the question that we're looking for, is that how this firm-to-firm, so think about the specific match between a seller and a buyer, how this affect price setting behavior from a firm, okay? So I'm going to be just telling you things about the data. We're also working on a model, and that is actually a work in progress, okay? So what we're going to show you today is some new piece of evidence about price rigidity characteristics at the firm-to-firm relationship. Again, think about sellers and a buyer, okay? We're going to rely on administrative data from Chile. I'm going to collect prices at this very granular level, which is the price that a specific supplier charged to a specific buyer for a specific variety, okay? So we're really looking at the micro level here in terms of the price setting, okay? Then we're going to study the role that this match-specific characteristics plays in the rate by which prices change. In particular, think about the bilateral market share. So if you're a buyer, let's say that I'm offering you a very specific product to you, you don't have any way to substitute that product. So in some sense, the degree of that connection is very important for you. So if I change the price for you, you don't have anything to do other than keep buying that from me. Okay, I'm going to classify this in terms of that bilateral market share and how that bilateral market share matters in terms of the price stickiness, okay? And we're going to show you, I'm going to show you some results about the probability that that price changes and also the magnitude of the change, so both the extensive and the intensive margin at some sense, okay? And then towards the end, I'm going to show you some evidence about how a specific shock, think about the cost push shock, in particular an oil price shock, how that transmits over the network, again, as a function of this specific match characteristics, in particular this bilateral market share, okay? And as I was saying at the beginning, so we're currently working on a theoretical model, trying to make sense of this result, trying to think about how, in a theoretical way, we can kind of discipline the pass-through in the firms, and this is something that we're currently working on, and I'm not going to have much to say today. I'm going to show you the data for the sake of this presentation, okay? So this is the last session. Let me just tell you what we found in case you are kind of a little bit tired at the moment. So I'm going to show you that there's a significant heterogeneity in the price stickiness. This is something that we knew already. So we knew that the heterogeneity in sectors is very different. So the frequency by which price changes in, let's say, the manufacturing sector is very different from the frequency by which the price changes in, let's say, the retail sector. But I'm going to show you that even within sectors, so firm from manufacturing offering some good to another firm in services is very different from the price that we observe from the same firm in manufacturing offering the same good but to another firm, let's say, in services or retail, okay? So there's lots of heterogeneity even within a sector. I'm going to show you that precisely through all the data, okay? I want to show you also that in terms of the probability that a price change, suppliers that had more bilateral market power relative to their buyers actually change their prices much more often, and they pass through the price, and they pass through the shocks much more frequently as a function of the bilateral market share. I'm going to show you that also there's a higher pass-through of the oil price shock once you condition on two things. One, when you're conditioning on the bilateral market share from the seller point of view, and also when you condition on the specific position of that firm within a network, okay? Again, I'm going to be much more precise about what that network position is in a few minutes, okay? And yes, I was saying, so we're trying to kind of connect this with a very stylized SS menu cost model that is hopefully able to make sense of these results. It's something that is work in progress at the moment, okay? So for the sake of time, let me skip the literature and let me just show you the data that we're going to use, okay? So as I was saying, we have the universe of daily firm-to-firm, think about a seller and a customer transactions in Chile from 2018 to 2023, all right? So think about it this way. If you have a firm in Chile, you are enforced by law to fill up, let's say, like an invoice where you put information about what type of product you are selling to the specific buyer, the date when you are when the purchase was made, the price per unit, the type of product, and the specific location. Okay. Through that, let's say, invoice for every transaction between a seller and a buyer in Chile, I cannot stress enough that this is a universe of daily transactions. We're going to use machine learning tools to try to identify the prices and also to identify the variety, okay? I'm going to be very specific about what a variety is in a few minutes, okay? So we have information about one seller offering some specific variety to different buyers. On top of this, and from that we're going to generate this triplet, okay? This PIJV, I for the seller, J for the buyer, and V for the variety, okay? In terms of how we define a variety, we're going to follow strictly what variety is for the CPI and the PPI basket. So we're going to match this. We're not going to come up with different varieties. We're going to follow what the CPI and the PPI is. We're trying to match official statistics through our data. And we allow for some control. So we ask for each variety to appear at least 24 times for any supplier. So if you're in the invoice, you are typing, I don't know, a can of Coke or Diet Coke, I want that specific, the same name to appear at least 24 times, okay? The same, I don't know, can of Diet Coke, okay? On top of this, we have information from both sides of the transaction. So we have balance sheet information from both the seller and the buyer. So we can classify the seller between if there's large or small. So we have information about the total sales of the seller, the employment, the industry where they belong to, also the buyer, the client. Okay, if the client is big or small, the industry for the client is, the size, etc. Okay. And these are examples of how you can think about a specific variety. So typically in the PPI, you start kind of unpacking the typical classes of a variety. You start with, in this case, we got processing and preserving of fish, crustacean and mollusk and shellfish. That's a class. That you can break it in different subclasses. Let's say you can read here on top. This is like flours, meals, powders, and pellets. And within that subclass, you got a product, which is fish flour. Okay. And within fish flour, you got a variety. Fish flour type A, fish flour type B, etc. Okay, and we're going to work with this level, this is segregation. All right. So, and we do this for all firms that we can observe in the economy. Okay. And remember the fish flour example that's going to be useful for later. Okay. As I was saying, so we match this with the PPI data. You can see it here. So the red line, the red solid line, is the PPI data from the, let's call the official statistical office in Chile, and the dashed line is our constructed PPI using the same classification, using our data. You can see that the correlation is pretty obvious, and we're actually collecting and we're able to replicate the evolution of the PPI using our data, our very granular data. Okay, so let me show you something about the frequency. When the central banks, we need to talk about how frequently prices change, okay? So here on top, you got the frequency of price change, which you just focus on the seller point of view. So forget about the connection between a buyer, just look at how frequently each seller is changing the price. So on average, you get a change of price of almost 0.3. And then you break this into the triplet, so the seller-buyer variety. On average, that price is roughly the same, okay? Which if you have some number in your mind about, well, typically this number is way higher than the liters have been saying. So in our data, you got one price changing on average every 3 months. Whereas if you look at like Anual and Steins and all of these papers talking about the CPI price, you get one change every kind of between 8 to 9 months. In our data, the price change much more faster, and this is basically because we had the COVID pandemic right in between. So you can see here, we estimate the frequency of the price change using a rolling window and the accumulated change, large increase in the frequency of price change 1 year after the pandemic. There's a lot of discussions. So in Chile, there's a lot of the supply side, as I was telling before, increased a lot. So that's why it was very inflationary, some of the policies. Okay, that's why you get so frequent on the price. So we need to take this into account when we start estimating with our data. Okay, this is what the literature has been saying. So if you look at the price stickiness at the sectoral level, and if you compute that price stickiness using either the average across the sector or either the median across the sector, and these are the two figures here, you will end up concluding what the literature has been saying. So lots of heterogeneity in terms of how frequently price changes in, let's say, the manufacturing sector relative to the service sector. And this is something that we knew, okay? But then if you break this between, so here on the vertical axis, I got the industry of the supplier. Here I got the industry of the customer, so the buyer. You can see that's lots of heterogeneity even across the sectors. So one thing is that if you take, let's say, the sector 40, okay, whatever, let's say that this is manufacturing. If you take the average of that sector over like a row mean, you will end up with this number here, which is the literature I've been saying. But on top of this, you can see that, well, a firm at this sector actually is changing the price differently from a firm in another sector. And then if I condition on the same firm in the sector, you get a different rate of changing prices from the same firm but to another sector. We have the example here of a firm in the copper mining sector change prices 19% of the time to firms in the construction industry, and change the price for the same product 50% of the times for another firm in the retail sector. And this should matter in terms of the propagation, all right? This match, this client variety match. Okay, let me rush a little bit. So we can run this type of regression. So here on the left, I'm going to put the price level. Think about the level of the price at this triplet. You can think about the probability that the price change, so 0, 1 if the price change, 0, 1 if the price goes up, 0, 1 if the price goes down, and also the magnitude, okay, the intensive margin. You can saturate this with all the fixed effects that you want. So you can put fixed effect at the seller level, fixed effects at the buyer level, and fixed effects at the variety time level. This is mostly to take into account all this rise in the frequency that we look at the COVID pandemic. Okay, and here in the X variables, we're going to allow for some very specific match explanatory variables. Okay, in particular, think about the bilateral market share of the seller, as I was saying at the beginning. So you're a customer. You're just buying fish flour from me. I only care about this specific variety of fish flour. So in this case, you will have a 1 here because I'm summing all the sales from that specific buyer. Okay. So most of the time, so many times you'll have a 1 here, meaning that if you have a 1 here, 1 there, you're only buying the specific set of fish flour from me and from nobody else. There are some other goods that have much power of substitution, and we want to allow this variable to take this into account. Same thing from the other point of view, from the buyer point of view. Now think about, I'm selling this fish flour, and on the other hand, on the other side of the street, I have a big supermarket that's buying me like 80% of my fish flour. Perhaps I'm going to treat this big supermarket better in terms of the price relative to selling the same fish flour to a small shop, a corner shop, right? This is going to be included here in the X. So the market share from the buyer point of view, okay? Also, we have some controls about how many transactions we do in a specific time window, and also how long have we know each other, the duration of the relationship. This is mostly to try to connect it with the presence of a contract. If we know each other from 2 years from now, perhaps I can put a contract there for us to transact this fish flour, and that obviously is going to make the rate of the change of the price less frequent, perhaps, okay? So these are the results. Here in the first column, you get the level of the price. As you can expect, higher price or higher the bilateral market share of the seller, you get the higher price, all right? So if you get a 1 there at the S, the price will be 1.6% higher relative to the same variety, but from another seller that doesn't have the bilateral market power. It's not very important for me as a buyer. Same thing with the seller bilateral market share. So if I'm selling fish flour to this big supermarket that actually accounts for 80% of my total sales, most likely I'm going to lower the price for that guy. And actually the data support this as well. It's on the frequency, again, same thing. So more market power from the seller point of view, the higher the frequency that the price will change at the variety level. Same thing with the buyer. So I'm going to change the price less often to this big supermarket, whereas I'm going to change the price probably more often to this small corner shop, okay? That's in the data. And also in terms of the duration, you can see here that across all the estimate, the duration is always negative, meaning that the longer that we know each other, perhaps you expect to have a lower price. As I was saying at the beginning, this could presumably be related to some contract that we have in force already, okay? That's going to prevent the prices to change very frequently. Same thing with the intensive margin, in terms of the magnitude of the price change, same story. So the higher the seller bilateral market share, the magnitude of the price change is also higher. On the other side, the higher the buyer market share, the less change in terms of the magnitude. So it's evidence about both the extensive and the intensive margin. And for the sake of time, let me just go to this network effect, okay? So think about an oil shock. And actually think about this kind of network, okay? So here, there's going to be a massive oil price change, which is exogenous for the Chilean economy. And think about this initial node. In Chile, we have like a government and owned company, which if you're in Chile, you will know the name for sure, but for the sake of the data, you cannot say the name, but if you are Chilean, you will know the name, that actually collects all the oil and sell it to all the firms in the economy. That's going to be my first node, the J0. This is literally the firm that is kind of trespassing all the oil to the firms in the economy. Then these two underneath nodes, the J1 and J2, let me call them like big oil sellers. So think about Petrobras, for instance, that half of their sellers are just oil, crude oil, right? It's not only Petrobras, could be also like a transport company, whatever, okay? So I'm going to classify these firms here as very large oil sellers. And then all the firms underneath are buyers of the oil. And since oil is very important, it's a very important input for all firms in the economy, underneath here you have tons of different firms from tons of different sectors, retail, minery, etc., okay? And what we're going to do, I'm going to show you how, when the oil price hits the economy, so hits here, how it's going to pass through to the firms in the underneath nodes, okay? So we're kind of running this kind of local projection, extensive margin type of regression. On the left, I got the probability of price change of 0.1. Here's the oil price shock, and obviously that's endogenous, so we're going to have an instrument to instrument that object there, and I'm going to saturate this with all the fixed effect that I already showed you, and I'm going to classify, as I was saying, the market position. So these firms here are the very highly oil sellers, okay? gasoline stations, for instance, okay? And this is the probability that if you're focusing on this layer of the network, this is the probability by which price will change after the oil shock, all right? So the probability goes up by around 30% 3 months after the shock, all the way up until more than 50% of the probability goes up 1 year after the shock, okay? Same if you think about, well, the probability that the price go down, that probability is actually negative because the old shock is positive in our estimates, okay? All right, so that's kind of interesting, but then what if we split this between the market share, okay? What if we interact the same oil shock with my variable about the bilateral market share? How important, if I'm a buyer, how important is the seller? So if I'm buying all the fish flour from you, or if I'm buying some fish flour and this fish flour is very expensive, well, I'm just going to the other store and buy it from them. And you can see there is a significant heterogeneity in terms of the pass-through. The probability that I pass through that oil price shock, if you have lots of bilateral market share, actually goes all the way until 60%, whereas if you look at the firms that are not, the connection is not so stringent, let's say, that the probability of change is much less. Statistically, they're very different, okay? The market share, the bilateral market share from the seller point of view matters. This is not the same if you look at the buyer point of view, because here the difference is not really statistically different, okay? And then think about the pass-through, so intensive margin, okay? Same exercise, but now which part of the oil shock transpass to prices in this sense. Here on the left, you got the J0, this big nationally owned company. 2 months after the shock, pass-through is equal to 1. So full pass-through 2 months after. But then if you look underneath, so now I'm doing this path here, from J0 to J1 or J2. Here on the left, so here on the right, you got an incomplete pass-through, and actually the pass-through hits 75% 2 months after the shock and then stays there, okay? And then what if we split this between the degree of bilateral market share? Again, in terms of the pass-through is almost complete at 75%, depending on the bilateral market share of the seller, where that pass-through doesn't even reach 50%, it almost reach 50% when you look at the firms on the other side of the distribution. So the firms that are able to don't buy the fish flour from me and buy it from somebody else. Okay, so lots of heterogeneity when you take into account the bilateral market share. I'm running out of time, I know. So let me just conclude. Big, enormous data effort here to come up with this result. And in a nutshell, so hopefully convinced that it's lots of price thickness heterogeneity, not only between the sectors, but also within the sectors that I just showed you. This match-specific characteristics really matter in terms of the frequency by which prices are changing. There are no asymmetric effects. I wasn't able to show you, but if you look at the market share at the seller point of view, just forget about the bilateral market share, there's no asymmetric effects. So the effects are literally the same. So it's really something about the match specific that is taking into account the different response of the price, okay? And there will provide evidence that the network position matters for the market share. And as I was saying at the beginning, I'm going to say for the third time, we're currently working on a model, a menu cost model, with non-constant demand elasticity to try to make sense of these results. Sorry if I passed time.
Thanks, Javier. Now we have Willem to discuss this paper.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for letting me discuss this really interesting paper. So I'll just give a very brief my review and kind of some of the key takeaways. Not going to do it justice, but just to get to add some comments to it. So the paper studies the role of buyer-seller characteristics for the frequency of price adjustment. of firms and uses very, as you've heard, very rich, very granular data of these buyer-seller transactions for basically all tax-paying firms in Chile. And the key finding, I think, in one sense, is that buyer-seller relationships are important in accounting for heterogeneity in this frequency of price adjustment. So in particular, it looks from the regressions that these relationships could be at least as important as product characteristics. Also, key finding is that a larger supplier share of firms is associated with a higher frequency of price adjustment. And then also a bit on the role, so these two periods, the pre-COVID and the post-COVID, we see that there's the role of supplier share becomes stronger during the COVID period. And then conditional on oil price shocks, kind of capturing a cost shock, the FPA, the frequency of price adjustment, increases more for firms that have larger supplier shares. So very kind of interesting, thought-provoking results. There's a lot to like, I think, in terms of this empirical work, this very impressive data set, as I already said, and also impressive work they've done, goes really beyond a lot of the literature that it's connected to is based on looking at importers and exporters. So here we see many, in particular, many small firms. So it gives us a kind of very unique picture. Another thing that kind of stood out in the paper for me is that it's important to distinguish between the extensive margin and the intensive margin of price adjustment. So the frequency of price adjustment being on the extensive margin, whereas the size of pass-through being the intensive margin. So thought-provoking empirical results in particular. So Javier already said that they're working on the model. So I couldn't help being also having to think about how do you interpret these results, in what kind of framework. So I'll talk a little bit, one comment. Another comment is, I think there's scope here. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about explaining why the FPA, the frequency of price adjustment, rose so sharply in the COVID pandemic, even compared to previous high inflation periods. And then had some comments on the role of firm size and the duration of the buyer-seller relationships. Maybe throughout I'll reference US data. I'm kind of implicitly assuming that the Chilean data and the US data have kind of more broader significance than just for US or Chilean economy. So on the first point, how to interpret the results. So basically, kind of the key takeaway is for a firm, the more a firm depends on a supplier for a product, the more likely that supplier is going to raise their price on you. So then why would I put up with that? Why would a firm depend on a single supplier or heavily on a supplier? So I can think of two stories. One is market power. So there could be a lack of alternative suppliers that makes my demand inelastic. And then another framework, which when you talk about long-term relationships, you think about search costs. So it could be the case that these firms are locked into these long-run relationships because of these costs, like for instance, search costs. As I mentioned, what's really nice here is they have so many small firms. There's a huge firm size heterogeneity in the sample, and I think that could help to differentiate between these different accounts. And one specific suggestion is that, so the authors could calculate Herfindahl-Hirschman indexes by product and then test if the effect of supplier share on the frequency of price adjustment is stronger in more concentrated markets, kind of would lead more to think about market power than perhaps search costs. But yeah, as you know, so they're in the middle of that, so I don't know if this is of any use. Another comment is on so the frequency of price adjustment varies with inflation. And this is a picture, well-known picture from Nakamura, Steinson, Sun, and Villar's paper, which plots both inflation. They took the data on frequency of price adjustment for the US back to 1978. And so you see inflation and the frequency of price adjustment moving closely together, in particular, like late 70s, early 80s, both were very high. So inflation peaked at over 10%, say 12%, and the frequency of price adjustment went to something like 18%. Now, recent work has extended this to include the COVID inflation period. And here I want to kind of draw your attention to the solid lines, and you can just ignore. I'm not going to bother with the dashed lines. But so the green line here is inflation. As we know, it peaked, the peak was lower, it's like 8%, and yet the frequency of price adjustment jumped even higher than in the late 70s, so it went over, say, 22% or something. So there is you could say frequency of price adjustment in the recent episode rose more than what would be predicted based on the experience of the late 70s. And so what are some of the developments since then? Well, there's a lot of developments, but one that relates to the paper, I think, and to the interpretation of the results is that market power has increased in recent decades. This is just an illustration from De Lucker, Eekhout, and Unger on the average markup. It's showing the average markup they compute. But another thing we know is that in the inflation period, there was severe supply shortages. And here this chart shows the global supply chain pressure index of the New York Fed. So you see that spiked during the COVID years. So it kind of raises the question potentially of, could buyer-seller characteristics account for this unexpectedly large rise in the frequency of price adjustment during COVID? Because one reason could be the rise of market power may have reduced the number of alternative suppliers, kind of give more, make this supplier share more pertinent. And supply shortages could alternatively or as well have been relevant by increasing those lock-in effects. For instance, if the probability of finding an alternative supplier is very low because of supply shortages, then that effectively raises the search cost. So I think basically, to wrap this up, the focus on supplier-buyer relationships, I think, is a promising direction to better understand price setting during the pandemic, whether it be in this paper, maybe it's too much for this paper, or another paper. A comment on the relationship between supplier share and firm size. So there's evidence for the US by Goldberg and Hellerstein. They find that smaller firms have a lower frequency of price adjustments on the extensive margin, but they make when they change their price, they make larger price adjustments than large firms do. And that's consistent with other empirical evidence on the pass-through. And the paper shows this U-shaped unconditional relationship between a firm's average supplier share across its buyers and then its market share, so firm size. So you get large firms, they're kind of in two camps. Either they have very large supplier share or very small supplier share, whereas the smaller firms, they're in the middle with this relatively large but not the largest supplier share. So that's very interesting and kind of, to me, raise the question, what distinguishes these two types of large firms, those with high and with low supplier shares? I wonder if you can say more about it, but there could be data limitations or restrictions on what you can say, I realized. But maybe more harder question maybe is, can buyer-seller characteristics help account for the different pricing behavior of small and large firms? So basically there's this U-shaped relationship, but when you look closer, there's really most of the action is on the side where across most firms, smaller suppliers have the larger average supplier share, and most of the large firms will have a small supplier share. So that kind of suggests that these smaller suppliers also might have a higher frequency of price adjustment, kind of raising a sort of, how do you square that with this Goldberg-Hellerstein evidence? So I guess I'd encourage, or I'd be interested to see the authors further examine this connection, not just between firm size and supplier share, but then also how it's connected to the frequency of price adjustment. And then real quick, last comment on the duration of the buyer-seller relationship. So as Javier already showed, also there's this interesting contrast between how duration affects the extent of the frequency of price adjustment versus the pass-through. I would be interested to see some more facts documented about this duration of the relationship. In particular, when I read the paper, I assume these are long-lasting relationships, but especially for firms, small firms, you can imagine this is, say, a restaurant goes to the market every morning, finds the seller with the freshest fish, and that's the single supplier, but it could be a different supplier every day, whoever sells the freshest fish. So kind of just show what is the heterogeneity across firms in terms of this duration of the relationship. And you could look at sort of robustness within the sample, including only firms that really have long-lasting relationships between the buyers and the seller. So I'll just stop here. I'm out of time already, but I really enjoyed reading this paper.
Thank you, William. Now, Javier, can you comment?
Yes, thanks. Lots of very, very good comments. Some of them I really thought about that. Some quick reactions. So, yeah, market power search effort. Yeah, that's a good point. It's actually related to your comment about the size of firms, as I was telling you in our informal chat before the session starts. We do have the evidence for large and small firms. The pass-through is obviously larger for larger firms, and actually I think this you can try to interpret this as not only firms are large in terms of the linkages, but also are larger because they offer more types of varieties, and that's why also larger firms change prices more often when you take into account that the small firm is just offering one type of variety, whatever, and then the large one is offering different stuff. But then our initial reaction was, well, if this is really firm size related, this will be somehow captured by the fixed effect at the seller point of view and also the buyer point of view. But I agree that we can do more things about that to try to kind of rule out or to stress more the role of the size of both the buyer and the seller. And some other thing that I want to mention is I really like this comment about the COVID. Is actually what we have in mind in the model. So if you know this typical SS pricing model, typically if you get a volatility rise, you will be pushed away from this inaction region, and that will kind of give you more frequently changes in the price. That's something that is very common in the SS literature. So the volatility effects actually dominate the wait and see effect. But then, particularly for what we want to do with the model is actually when we take into account the bilateral market share. That's why we always say this or phrase this as bilateral market share rather than market power, because I don't want to be judged by all this IO literature. That's why we're very careful about saying bilateral market share, no market power. That's on purpose, actually. But my take is that when you take into account this bilateral market share, that frequency will amplify, and that will actually give me the role of how this actually amplifies the frequency on top of what a canonical SS model will tell you from a rise in the volatility. So yes, I have more reactions, but I don't want to just want to say before somebody wants questions.
Thanks. So we have some time for a couple of questions from the audience. Anybody? So please start your presentation, William.
Okay, thanks. I want to again thank the organizers for including this paper on the program. So this is a paper looking at implications of firm size and heterogeneity in strategic complementarity for inflation dynamics, real rigidity, monetary non-neutrality. We've been changing the title a lot. But it's work joined with Takushi Kurozumi of the Bank of Japan, and I feel for my peace of mind, I want to point out that these are our views and not necessarily the views of our employers, Bank of Japan or the Cleveland Fed. So the micro evidence on price setting, we've already talked about, so staying in the same topic, indicates that there's heterogeneity in strategic complementarity between firms. In particular, Amiti, Skokie, and Konings, they find that small firms, they fully pass through marginal cost shocks, whereas large firms, they exhibit strategic complementarity, meaning that they will large firms will respond to the prices of their competitors, and they have incomplete pass-through of marginal cost shocks. So in this paper, we're going to add some complementary evidence from firm survey data, panel data of the Atlanta Fed, and showing that cost pass-through declines significantly with firm size. So this is kind of the motivation for much of what we do next, because so I think the micro-evidence shows that firm size matters for price setting, and then a question for monetary policy, central banks is, does firm size then also matter for inflation? So that's where we're going with this next. So in the DSG literature, it's common for DSG models to feature strategic complementarity to induce real rigidity in relative prices. So those models will always, or almost always, as far as I'm aware, abstract from firm size. So the models are built around monopolistic competition with sticky prices, and then strategic complementarity comes in to make the Phillips curve flatter. And that way, that allows the modelers to reconcile evidence on the one hand of moderate price stickiness, the micro evidence, and on the other hand, VAR evidence of substantial monetary non-neutrality. So in such a model, we're going to introduce heterogeneity in strategic complementarity by firm size. Heterogeneity in firm size arises in the model because of differences in productivity levels across firms, and heterogeneity in price setting happens because small firms face a constant elasticity of demand, whereas large firms may face a variable elasticity of demand, which arises from a Kimball type non-CES aggregator. So just to kind of put a picture in your mind, these are two illustrative demand curves for one for a small firm, that is the dashed red line, and it's basically a constant because it has a constant elasticity, and then the solid blue line is a demand curve for a product of a large firm. And you see that there is some curvature in that demand curve. In particular, if you go from the right to the left, when the firm's relative price increases, the price elasticity of demand is also increasing. And so to kind of put some jargon here, the super elasticity, which is the price elasticity of the price elasticity of demand, is then non-zero, is positive, because as the price elasticity will change as the price changes, whereas for small firms, the super elasticity will be zero. So because we have this firm heterogeneity in productivity, we can use data to inform the values of those parameters governing the super elasticity. And we're going to calibrate the model using census data for employment, revenues, and costs, and we're going to look at 3 different firm size groups. And that calibrated model implies that large firms do exhibit stronger strategic complementarity, so consistent with the micro evidence, and so that's not something we impose. Also, larger firms in the model face because of that strategic complementarity, face a less elastic demand and have larger markups than small firms, which also agrees with other evidence. And the average super elasticity looking across all firms, small and large, will be in line with micro estimates. So our main result is that once you account for this heterogeneity in strategic complementarity, then it does no longer induce much real rigidity, and so it does not materially increase monetary non-neutrality in the model. So we're going to show that by looking at impulse responses of inflation and output to a monetary policy shock, and find that those responses in our calibrated model with heterogeneity are almost the same as those in the case where all firms just have a constant elasticity of demand. And that holds even if the cost pass-through is much smaller for larger firms than for small ones. And the price setting condition kind of explains what happens, relating the optimal price to the real marginal cost and the optimal price of other firms. And so there are going to be spillover effects from other firm prices, and those spillover effects, say, of small firms to larger firms' prices will increase with the revenue share of small firms. Strategic complementarity of large firms also lowers their real marginal cost elasticity, of course, and their revenue share relative to that of small firms. So okay, so before I get to the details, I think so kind of the takeaway is that, so when you account for heterogeneity in strategic complementarity, that by firm size, that weakens real rigidity, because large firms that exhibit this complementarity will bring their product prices in line with those of small firms who more fully pass through their costs. And that suggests that real rigidity induced by homogeneous strategic complementarity appears to be an artifact of that homogeneity, just that all firms set their price in the same way. And that makes that this influence of the other firm's prices is no longer relevant. And I think it matters for policy, what the source of real rigidity in the model is, because that can matter for optimal policies, what has been shown in other work. Quickly, related research is, so firm size, usually people look at the implications for business fluctuations. There's a connection here with the sectoral heterogeneity in nominal price rigidities, where Carlos Carvalho is a pioneer of that field. And so here we're going to keep nominal rigidities constant and focus on differences in real rigidities. There's also connection with the recent work on market power and strategic price setting, where they basically endogenize this strategic behavior, and then there's some connection with other work that challenges the role of strategic complementarity for inflation dynamics. So in the rest of my time, I'll just briefly touch on our empirical evidence. I'll talk about the model and the calibration, and then show you some results. So we use this business inflation expectation survey of the Atlanta Fed, where they survey firms in the 6th Federal Reserve District. There is a question on price growth, which is effectively how much did you change your price in the past 12 months. There's a question on cost growth, but that is a kind of a categorical question. Firms have to choose, my costs are down, they're up a little, they're up a lot. So we're going to treat that as an interval variable, kind of assuming that each of these categories covers a similar range of values for cost growth, thinking that that's pretty innocuous, because in the end what we're interested in is comparing those cost growth elasticities across firm size. So if one range is larger for all firm size groups, it shouldn't really matter. And in the data we can distinguish a lot of firm sizes, but we're going to focus on 3 firm size groups in terms of their employment. So these are the results. If you focus on the first column for the main sample, you see that the cost elasticity is interacted with the dummy for firm size. And so the first row shows the cost elasticity for small firms, then the second for middle firms, and then the third one is for large firms, and that is smaller and insignificant. And we can do a wall test, testing whether these cost elasticities are the same for firms across firm size, and that is rejected in the bottom line. So, and the next columns kind of do some robustness, but the main takeaway is there's a statistically significant less pass-through of costs for large firms. So then we're going to write down this DSGE model where there's a continuum of firms that each produce a differentiated good. They have Cobb-Douglas production in capital labor and heterogeneity in their TFP levels. So this is where firm size comes from. There's Calvo-style staggered price setting, and then there's a composite good producer, an aggregator of these firm outputs that combines the differentiated goods using a generalized Kimball aggregator. So we allow for heterogeneity in the superelasticity of demand across firm sizes. And then the rest of the household side of the model and the monetary policy Taylor rule is there's really nothing different going on, so I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. So what's really changes here is the price setting of firms. So you see that at the top, the first order condition for price setting, which differs by firm size, that's why it's indexed by I. And so optimal price of a firm will depend on its expected future optimal price because of nominal rigidities, and of the expected future nominal optimal prices of the other firms, for smaller firms, say, or other sized firms. And then final term is the cost elasticity, that kappa I is also indexed by I, so that's there you see heterogeneity also across firm size. These omegas here, they denote the steady state revenue shares of other firms. And the marginal cost elasticity kappa I depends on the frequency of price adjustment psi, but also on this large capital gamma, which incorporates the super elasticity parameter epsilon. So when epsilon is 0, large gamma is just 1, but when epsilon becomes negative, that's going to blow up this gamma I, and thereby reduce the cost elasticity kappa I. So when all said and done, we log linearize this model, and the only change in this model is in the slope of the Phillips curve, where you can see that the slope is a weighted average of these cost elasticity components by firm size, weighted by their steady state revenue shares. Everything else is unaffected. We're going to calibrate some common parameters using common values. I'll just skip over this, and then talk a little bit about the calibration of the firm size specific model parameters. So we're going to target empirical labor shares and revenue shares by firm size group from the statistics of US businesses at the US Census Bureau. They have a lot more firm sizes, but a lot of them have small revenue shares, so we're going to consolidate this into 3 groups. And then the model steady state labor shares and revenue shares depend on the optimal reset price, the average markup, and those in turn depend on the relative TFP and on the super elasticity parameters. So that's how we can use the data to pin down those parameters. The first line is just the revenue share taken directly from the data. The second line is the relative productivity level, where we normalize the small firms' productivity to 1, and then we find that large firms have a TFP that's an order of magnitude larger than small firms. The next line is the super elasticity, depending on this parameter epsilon I, which we assume is 0 for small firms in line with micro evidence. And then the data indicate that the super elasticity increases with firm size, so up to 6.5 for the largest firms. And with more so then that implies this, the last 2 rows, the steady state variables P star I, the relative reset price, is smaller for more productive firms, whereas their average markup in steady state will be larger. So on to results. So we can look at impulse responses of inflation and output to a monetary policy shock. And so that's the first 2 panels at the top, where in our calibrated model, those impulse responses are shown by the dashed red line. Then also, as a kind of benchmark, we show the blue solid line is the model where there is no strategic complementarity. Simply, every firm has a constant elasticity of demand. And so it stands out right away that these impulse responses are almost indistinguishable. So heterogeneity and strategic complementarity doesn't affect noticeably these impulse responses. In our calibrated model, with the heterogeneous complementarities, the average superelasticity across firms, so we call it curvature, sigma, is equal to 3.57. So if we take that number and we stick it in the model, the sort of the counterpart model with homogeneous firms, so no firm size differences or no differences, if everybody has the same strategic complementarity, then you can see by the black dotted lines rather, that superelasticity of 3.57 will dampen the inflation response and so amplify the output response. Now on the right side, you see the right panel is this marginal cost elasticities kappa I in the 3 versions. So the benchmark of constant elasticity of demand for everyone, that's the blue dashed lines. If you introduce strategic complementarity homogeneously for all firms, that will dampen the kappa I's, the cost elasticities, but dampen it for all firm sizes. And then probably surprisingly, or potentially, maybe surprisingly, for our calibrated model with heterogeneity and complementarities, the cost elasticities are essentially unchanged, so they don't fall even for large firms under our calibration. So what's going on there? So kind of, let me walk through those results quickly. Strategic complementarity concentrated in large firms doesn't materially increase monetary non-neutrality, so there's impulse responses. There's also little change in the cost price pass-through of large firms. That's the right panel, and that's because strategic complementarity and firm size have offsetting effects in the calibrated model. So if you look at this big gamma I factor, the strategic complementarity factor again, a larger epsilon I for large firms will increase gamma I. That will be amplified by a larger average markup mu for those firms, but those firms are also, the large firms are also the productive firms with a small relative reset price, and that's going to reduce big gamma I. So on balance, we have in the calibration no decline in the cost elasticities. Now you can induce a smaller cost elasticity for large firms by basically increasing the strategic complementarity in the model or reducing the firm size, making firms less different in terms of size. And then you can kind of force this effect of strategic complementarity to start dominating the effect of firm size. And so I'll do that next and show you that even then, this there is still no effect on, there's still no increase in monetary non-neutrality in those, when we change those calibrations. So this hopefully can help kind of show a little bit more what's going on. I'm going to increase the strategic complementarity for these different firm size groups here. So it requires a little explanation. So you can see on the horizontal axis, the superelasticity is raised from 0 to 10. The dashed line at the top is our slope of our Phillips curve in our model, so called kappa. And you can see that regardless of the superelasticity, the slope remains at this roughly, essentially at the same level as if there is a constant elasticity of demand, as if superelasticity is 0. And that's in contrast with the model, the counterpart model where firms are homogeneous, where that the dotted line, you see that with homogeneous firms, as you increase the superelasticity, the slope of the Phillips curve will become smaller. So why doesn't it become smaller in our model? Now, you can look at those colored solid lines. So the red or pink, the red line traces out the cost elasticity of kappa 3 of the largest firms, while I hold the cost elasticities of the small and medium firms constant, so at their values of respectively 0 and 4.5. And so with those fixed, when I increase the superelasticity of the largest firms, you'll see that at first that kappa I, the red line, stays flat for a while because its firm size has offsetting effects, but eventually strategic complementarity starts to push down this kappa 3 for the large firms. So their cost elasticity will eventually decline. But at the same time, in the rightmost panel, you see that large firms' revenue shares will also decline. So there's a shift in revenue shares as this, even though the large firms have a lower reset price, as the superelasticity increases, their markups will increase. So this differential between prices of small and large firms will vanish, and revenue share will shift from larger firms to smaller firms. And as a result, then, the weighted average, our slope of our Phillips curve remains basically constant. So, so here we go back to the original exercise of the impulse responses, but we amplify we basically scale up the superelasticity parameters to increase to double the superelasticity to 7.14, and compare it with a comparable model with homogeneous strategic complementarity. And you can basically see the impulse responses are again unaffected by heterogeneity when it's concentrated in large firms, in contrast to the standard case where homogeneity complementarity is homogeneous. But now, because of the stronger strategic complementarity, in the right panel, you do see that the cost elasticity of larger firms becomes much smaller, so basically essentially 0. A last exercise is when we abstract from firm size. So you could say firm size is necessary to calibrate the model and have these different superelasticity values for different firm sizes. But once we have those, let's set TFP to 1 for all firms, and then this is the result. So again, so now you basically shut down this effect of firm size, and you see in the right panel that as a result, larger firms which have more strategic complementarity have a smaller cost elasticity in line with microdata, and yet these impulse responses are unchanged. So again, no effect of complementarity, no increase in monetary non-neutrality because of heterogeneity and complementarity. I think I'm out of time, so let me jump to the conclusion. So we've presented evidence showing that cost pass-through declines with firm size. We've incorporated heterogeneity in strategic complementarity by firm size in a DSG model and calibrated it to data by firm size. We found that heterogeneous strategic complementarity doesn't materially increase monetary non-neutrality in that calibrated model, or for stronger complementarity or similar firm sizes. And I'll stop here.
Thanks, Willem. So now we invite Edwin to discuss.
Okay, Hey everyone, and thanks a lot, Willem, for this very nice presentation, and congrats on a very nice paper overall, which I really enjoyed reading. So, I mean, just to give a very brief summary of the paper, so it basically has two parts. So in the first part, the paper wants basically to answer the question, do strategic complementarities at the firm level vary with the firm size? And in order to answer that question, they will use some survey data on firm level prices and costs. And they provide evidence that the cost pass-through of firms is significantly higher for small firms relative to large firms. And then in the second part, which I think is really like the main contribution of this paper, they want to answer the question, okay, but does this really matter for aggregate dynamics? And then they develop this quantitative model that incorporates heterogeneity both along the size or the productivity dimension and in terms of the super elasticity of demand. And in order to do this, they incorporate or they include this kind of a Kimball aggregator in order to have strategic complementarities in price setting. And as we just saw, the results show that the impulse responses to a monetary policy shock are virtually identical in the model that completely abstracts from strategic complementarities in price setting. And the intuition behind this result is that the large firms that actually exhibit strategic complementarities, they will bring prices in line with the small firms that don't, and then this will mitigate the overall real rigidities in the price setting. So the conclusion is that the importance of strategic complementarities in price setting crucially depends on how you model firm heterogeneity in this type of setup. So I mean, overall, I think this is a very, very interesting and relevant paper. It has, an empirical part that uses a rich data set to provide evidence on firms' price-setting behavior, and it develops, a fairly complicated quantitative model that incorporates firm heterogeneity along several dimensions. So overall, I think it's a great and very interesting paper. But I will have three main comments or questions related to both the empirical and the model part. So, if we start with the empirical part, so the authors estimate the following specifications. On the left-hand side, we will have the change in prices, and on the right-hand side, we will have the change in costs interacted with this firm size indicator. And what we find is that we can reject the hypothesis that the cost pass-through across the firm size distribution is equal. So basically, the small firms pass on more costs than the large firms. So I have just, I think maybe there are two potential concerns with this setup. So first, just briefly, as always with these kinds of regressions, I mean, costs could potentially be endogenous and or measured with some error. So, I mean, the first question is basically whether you have considered some type of instrument to kind of potentially mitigate these errors. I'm not sure whether this is a huge concern in the setup, but just wanted to ask whether that could be something to consider here. And then my second point, which is perhaps more interesting, is related to the fact that, I mean, here we're really estimating the cost pass-through. But different degrees of cost pass-through doesn't necessarily imply different levels of strategic complementarities. So in fact, I mean, it could as well reflect different degrees of nominal rather than real rigidities. So I was just thinking about different ways one could try to potentially test this. And one way would perhaps be to try to trace out the dynamic responses of the prices. So if the differences remain constant over a longer horizon, then I think this would be a stronger evidence that this really has to do with real rather than nominal rigidities. I mean, a completely alternative way would be, so ideally we would want to include a measure here of the competitor prices. And of course that may not be readily available, but just one idea that I had was that maybe we can, in case we have some industry code in the dataset, I don't know if that's available, but if that would be, we could construct a measure for competitor prices as the average price within the same industry that you're operating in. And then we can include also that in the regression to kind of separate between these two components. Okay, so the next comment has to do with the overall classification between small and large firms. So these firm groups that we saw. So in the empirical part, the authors classify small firms, so the smallest group, as firms with less than 100 employees. And this is also the same as the Amiti paper, which is kind of a key reference in this context. But in the model calibration, we have instead that small firms are those with less than 1,000 employees. So it's a bit of a difference here. And the revenue share in this small firm group is 40%. So then I was just thinking, what does this imply for the aggregate dynamics? So, I mean, if we would reduce this revenue share of the small firms, potentially that would mean that the group, that will mean that the group exerts less influence on aggregate prices. And then, potentially, that could make that the large firms that actually exhibit strategic complementarities will take prices of these firms less into consideration. So basically my question here is that if we would adjust this calibration, would that actually have implications for the aggregate dynamics? That's just something I would be happy to see as a robustness check. And then my final comment is related to super elasticity of demand, which is really like the key object in this setup. So, we have for a firm of type I, it's given by the sigma I, which is a function both of the parameters from the Kimball aggregators, theta and epsilon, but also of the relative demand, so your own output relative to the aggregate output. And as we heard just recently, there is a notion of two counteracting effects going on in this model, and we heard it being discussed in the context of the marginal cost elasticities. But I just wanted to raise the question of whether it could also be important for the super elasticity, because we vary the epsilon to get kind of heterogeneity into the super elasticity. But when we have also heterogeneity in firm size, that implies that this relative demand component will also be different, and they will be counteracting. So my final question basically has to do with how large are these counteracting effects, and what are kind of the final differences in the super elasticities, given that we have these two different effects. And I think what kind of made me think about this was in figure 4, one of the robustness checks, we have kind of this calibration where we actually set the epsilon to the same number for all firms, which is the black bars here. But then we still have different marginal cost elasticities, which is due to this fact that actually the productivity levels will be different. So, to conclude, I think it's a really nice paper. I really enjoyed reading it. It has a very clear and intuitive mechanism. And, in a more broad perspective, the paper points towards the potential importance both of considering strategic price setting and firm heterogeneity to understand better aggregate dynamics and monetary policy transmission. And I think, modeling more realistic price setting behavior in quantitative new Keynesian models like this one, I think serves as an overall very important contribution. So thanks a lot, and best of luck with the future work with this paper. Thanks.
Thanks, Edwin. William, you may react to this one.
I think first and foremost, thank you very much for those comments. Very helpful and insightful. In particular on the panel regression, your first comment, and this is the area where I feel like most out of my water. I've been pestering my econometrician colleagues already a lot of times. But so, I think definitely I need to think more about these questions you raised in terms of endogeneity, I guess I was not concerned about firms' price being able to really affect that. I guess I don't really see the channel, but it is true that it's something that I can't just maybe assume that it's not there. You're right, so we focus on the cost pass-through that is, and then that is not directly made. There could be other things going on, a strategic complementarity. One thing that kind of reassured me is that this evidence I mentioned of Goldberg and Hellerstein, so they show that large firms, they adjust their prices more frequently, which would kind of go in the wrong direction here. But still it's, yeah, and I definitely, maybe after we can talk more about your idea about with the industry codes, and yeah. Second point also, yeah, well taken. So the small firm, we have this two small firm sizes in the paper, which is not great. It's really, yeah, it's kind of, you bring this macro data, it's so different from the survey data, and you kind of have to see what you can do. But we did, for what it's worth, we actually for a long period, we worked with 5 groups, where the small group was less than 500, which is more often small and medium and SMEs or so. 1,000 it's a borderline small, I guess you could debate it for sure. But the point is that with those 5 groups, the results are unchanged. I guess there is this, this gamma, the revenue share is very slow to start picking up. And then for the large firms, it's really sensitive, yeah. It's very skewed. We also did 8 groups where it also didn't change, but I can't remember what the smallest size looked like there. Yeah, but I agree that this is a tricky point. And then your third point on supraelasticity of demand. Yeah. So the firm size. Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought. So the firm size clearly will affect the market share. Is part of the supraelasticity calculation. I think we follow the literature saying we're going to look at the point where it's 1, but if you don't do that, you're gonna. I think what's mainly going to happen is you're going to affect your comparison with say the homogeneous model, because your sigma curvature will be a different number. Yeah, so it's one of those things. Like, I guess I felt reassured, but clearly we could do more to reassure others there. Yeah. So thanks again. Yeah.
Well, are there any questions for the audience?
Just a very small question. So I really like the paper. So as you were saying, so the supraelasticity actually governs the curvature of the profit function. This is something that we usually know. But then, I was thinking, so if this matters for the pass-through of the large firm, then implicitly we're assuming. So in terms of the pass-through, we need to say something about where is the position of the supply, where we are standing in terms of the supply-demand curve, right? Because if we're in the inelastic part, where we're on the top of the profit, then for me intuitively I can change my price without much sacrificing some of the production, right? So implicitly, if the big firms are passing, the pass-through is actually lower, we're claiming that those firms particularly are in the elastic part of the demand, right? So I was thinking about, well, there's something in the data, I know you're referring to market share, but I kept thinking about the question that you have in the data, because they ask specifically for your main product, and probably the big firms have lots of products to offer, so perhaps I'm not going to dominate in my main product, but perhaps I'm going to dominate in my other products, which I'm presumably going to offer because I'm very large. And I would just hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure how to respond. It's because that's where your paper, your data is could be extremely insightful. Here, that's a good point. I don't have a better response. But thank you.
Anybody else? Or should we proceed and invite Edwin to present his own paper?
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot to the organizer for including our paper. It's a great pleasure to be here and present this paper. So this is joint work together with Matthias Klein at the Swedish Central Bank and Evi Papa in Madrid. And the usual disclaimers apply. So this will be a paper about supply curves. And as we know from our Econ 101 class, in order to trace out the slope of the supply curve, we need some exogenous shifter of the aggregate demand curve. And although this might seem as an obvious way in theory, in practice this is a very hard thing to get at because prices and quantities are typically determined simultaneously. And in the context of monetary policy, this is a crucial thing to try to estimate because we think that the slope of the supply curve is related to the slope of the Phillips curve, which, as we all know, is related to the effectiveness of monetary policy transmission. So in the existing literature, there have been many papers in the past that has tried to estimate the slope of the supply curve. I give one example here, which is a very nice paper. But what many of these kind of already existing papers have in common is that they use some sort of aggregated data. And what we will argue here in this paper is that this will mask important heterogeneity across the firm distribution. So what we will do is to compile a unique monthly firm level data set that contains information both on firms' prices and real output. It covers a representative sample of Swedish firms for more than 20 years, and importantly, it will include the recent surge in inflation period. So with this data set, we estimate the short and medium run responses to a plausibly exogenous demand shock. And importantly, the large cross-sectional variation that we have will allow us to investigate important non-linearities or state dependencies. So what we find is that on average, perhaps not very surprisingly, we find evidence of an upwardly sloping supply curve. In particular, a 1% increase in real output translates into a 0.35 increase in prices. And then we will find evidence on some important nonlinearities, and here we will separate between two types of nonlinearities. So first, we have them at the aggregate level, so think of the aggregate state of the economy. And then we will consider individual nonlinearities, so think about different firm characteristics. And the implications of this are, first, that responses to demand shocks are state dependent, and also, points towards evidence of a nonlinear Phillips curve. So let me just start briefly describing the data that we will use. So what we will do here is basically to combine a bunch of different Swedish microdata sets. In terms of prices, we use the product level micro price data that underlies the official Swedish producer price index. It covers a sample of products within the Swedish manufacturing sector, and it contains prices both on domestically sold, exported, and imported goods. In terms of output data, we use the firm level microdata that underlies the official Swedish industrial production index. And here we will have firm level nominal sales within the Swedish manufacturing industry, which we then deflate with price indices in order to get a measure of real output. And also here we will have information both on firms' domestic and export sales. So, what we in the end want to do is to merge these two data sets in order to have both prices and output at the monthly firm level. The little bit of the tricky part to get that is that the price data is at the product level and the output data is at the firm level. So I will not go into detail how we aggregate the price data, but just briefly, we use a third microdata set which allows us to construct weights representing how important each of the products are in the firm's total production. And then we can use these ways to aggregate up the prices to the firm level. So we basically construct a firm level price index. So then with this merged data set, we can additionally map on other data that we have. And in particular, we have balance sheet items that we will use for the universe of Swedish corporations. So just to give an idea here of the quality of the data, so when we have to merge these data sets, they're both representative samples, but that obviously implies some loss of information. So just to make sure that we don't end up with some kind of weird sample, I plot here the aggregate producer prices and industrial production, both for the full data set, so the official numbers, and with our merged data set. And what we can see here is that the aggregate numbers line up very well. Okay, so then, with this data set, we will estimate a bunch of empirical models. So first, we have the baseline model, where we basically aim to estimate the aggregate supply curve. So on the left-hand side, we have the change in prices over some horizon. On the right-hand side, we have the change in sales over the same horizon, together with some control variables and fixed effects. In the baseline analysis here, we will focus on domestic sales and prices. I will show you later some results also on exports. But that leaves us with roughly 50,000 observations. So then we are interested in potential nonlinearities or state dependencies. So what we'll do then is to create an indicator I that reflects the nonlinearity we're interested in, which we will interact this specification with. So this is essentially equivalent to running the baseline regression for two separate groups. So the main kind of challenge with this regression will obviously be the identification. So if we would estimate this thing using OLS, that will almost certainly be biased because of confounding supply shocks. So we will need some sort of instrument here reflecting exogenous demand shifters. What we will do in the baseline analysis is to rely on an external instrument that basically drives aggregate demand, so aggregate production, industrial production. And the shock is the one from Baumeister and Hamilton 2019, which identifies these global demand shocks using a VAR model of the oil market, basically. And then by imposing some sign restrictions on the VAR model, they identify this shock. So kind of the mechanism that we have in mind there is that we have an increase in world demand, which increases the demand for firms, for exporting firm sales. And that will be important because, firstly, because exporting firms are a very important component of the Swedish economy, but also because through domestic input linkages, this will in turn affect the demand for domestic goods. And that's where kind of our analysis comes in here. One potential concern, though, is that given that this is a demand shock that is kind of derived from oil prices, one might worry that there is a story of oil price increases going on here, which could affect firms' costs, so that this kind of shock would have a supply component as well. I will not show all of the robustness checks here in the interest of time, but I can just mention that we do a bunch of robustness checks, first of all, trying to control for these cost effects, so to control for oil prices, labor costs, and import prices. Alternatively, we will also rely on some other instrument, other demand shocks, and in particular, we use both monetary policy shocks for both the Swedish central bank and for the European Central Bank. And the results are robust to all of these checks, so we're not too worried that the supply component is driving the result here. Okay, so let's start here with the baseline result. So here I plot the estimate of the aggregate supply curve. On the left-hand side, In the upper graph, we have the kind of the slope, so the supply elasticity. In the lower graph, we have the F statistics to make sure that the instrument is strong enough. On the right-hand side, we have in the top the sales response to the shock, and in the lower one, we have the price response. So what we see here is that our estimate of the supply curve is around 0.3 to 0.35 after a horizon of 1 year. And this is pretty much in line with existing evidence in the literature. For instance, this paper I mentioned before, they find that the estimate is 0.24 also at the 1 year horizon. And just to give you a sense here about how important identification here is in this context. So here I plot our baseline result together with the estimates when just using a standard OLS estimator. And we see that the confounding supply shocks really plays a key role here. So the estimates are widely different if we not try to identify this coefficient properly. So now let's move on to the nonlinearities or the state dependencies, and first we'll focus on the aggregate ones, so basically the aggregate state of the economy. So our baseline sample ends in December 2021, and the main reason for that is that these weights that I mentioned that is used to construct firm-level price indices are only available until then. But if we make the assumption that the weights will be the same in 2021 and 2022, we will actually be able to extend the sample 1 year because all of the other data is available until the end of 2022. So if we do that and extend the sample and rerun the baseline estimate, which is the dotted green line here, we see that there's a kind of a big difference here in the slope. So what happens here is that for a given change in output, it seems that prices change considerably more if we are in a period of high inflation. All right. So we also find some evidence that uncertainty plays a very important role for determining the slope of the supply curve. And here we define uncertainty as, or we use a measure of financial uncertainty, in particular stock price volatility indices. And what we see here in this graph is that in terms of high financial uncertainty or high financial volatility, firms seem to be very reluctant to adjust their prices, as we see in the bottom right graph here. And then this will translate into a very flat or, even negative supply curve here, although the estimates are insignificant. So financial uncertainty seems to be very important here. We'll try to run some robustness checks to see whether this is only a story about recessions, but we don't find these results if we just look at recession versus boom. So this seems to be really something particular about financial uncertainty. Okay, so next we move on to the individual or the firm level state dependencies. So this first one is based on market power. So what we can do with this data is to compute the domestic market share of each of the firms in our sample. And then we basically split the sample into firms with low market shares and high market shares. And we estimate the supply curves for both of these groups of firms. And what we see here is that for the group with high market power, so the blue line, the price response to a demand shock is significantly stronger than for the low market power group, which then also translates into a steeper supply curve for this group. And this is kind of consistent with our intuition that firms with a high degree of market power would be more able to adjust their prices, and then which then would give rise to these kind of differences in supply curves. So finally, I will provide some evidence on exporting firms. So as I mentioned before, the main analysis is done for domestic prices and sales, but we have also information on exports. So basically what we can do is to estimate something like an export supply curve. And when we do that, we see that, and the export supply curve is plotted here in the dotted green, we see that there's a big difference, it seems, in the supply curves between the exporting firms and the firms only selling domestically. And when digging a little bit deeper into these results, what seems to drive this is that the exporting firms, there is a positive demand shock. Exporting firms increase their sales, but they seem very reluctant to adjust their prices. They don't adjust their prices until after around 8 to 10 months. So, although we have not explored this in more detail, one potential explanation for this could be that, exporting firms, they face international competition, therefore they face potentially much higher competition, and then they have less ability to kind of adjust their prices in response to these kinds of shocks. So, both of these individual state dependencies that we looked at kind of has some market power story to them. So in both cases, there seems to be that firms that face higher degrees of competition will adjust their prices less, and therefore their supply curve will be flatter. In the paper, we provide evidence of a bunch of other state dependencies, both at the firm level and at the aggregate level. But in the interest of time, I will not show all of them. But if you're interested, you can go and check them out. So to conclude, then we use a unique monthly firm level data set on prices and quantities, and we use it to estimate supply curves using IV local projections. We find that the average elasticity is about 0.3, but we find evidence of important non-linearities or state dependencies, both at the aggregate and at the individual firm level. And, when talking about policy, we believe that this will be highly important for policymakers, because, these non-linearities will then matter for the design of demand-side policies. So, both the aggregate state of the economy as well as the firm distribution with respect to these variables will be crucial to determine, the effectiveness and the transmission of demand shock, in particular, for instance, monetary policy shocks. So, what we're currently working on now is to kind of rationalize some of these findings in a model. So that will be kind of the future of this paper. Anyway, thanks a lot again for including this paper, and thanks for coming.
All right, I'll try to be brief. I know we are kind of tired at this point, but very nice paper. I really enjoy reading it. As you already saw, the main goal of this paper was to estimate the short-run elasticity of the supply. You've seen monthly firm level data from Sweden. And with the main focus on how firms change prices relative to quantities in response to these kind of global demand shocks, as you're referring to, is a very difficult question, as you just saw, because there's a lot of endogeneity. That's why the authors proposed this IV estimation using this series of global demand shocks. And they also run alternative specifications with the monetary policy shocks from the ECB and specific monetary policy shocks from the Swedish central bank, trying to isolate this endogenous variation in firm sales. There's, as we expect, sluggish reaction in the prices. So a 1% increase in sales brings 0.35% increase in the prices after 1 year. I really like this heterogeneity part, the state dependence of the effect. particularly when you didn't went much through about this financial uncertainty effect, unfortunately, because most of my comments are from that area, but still, so the paper shows that supply curves become more flatter in times of financial uncertainty, and as you just saw, so they're steeper when inflation is high, which implies that the price is more sensitive in these high inflation regimes, right? I really like the takeaway in terms of this time varying slope of the supply curve, which is absolutely matters for the monetary authority, for the central banks, trying to understand how the shock transmits into the economy, particularly with state dependence of the slope. So just so very interesting and very relevant. I really like the data. I cannot stress this enough, how this is a very challenging question because of the endogeneity. There are some concerns in the paper that you went through about the validity of the instrument. I don't want to say anything about that. I believe you that you have done all the controls that you can throw out there to make this as exogenous as possible to pass this the first stage, let's say. So I just want to focus. I have just 3 main comments on how you can potentially extend the scope of the paper. So here it is. So the first one is the empirical specification that you just saw. Here you got the price of the firm at time t, you got the fixed effects, and you care about that object there, this eta p, which is the elasticity of the supply curve. I keep thinking about what other potentially relevant variables that you can throw in there. Specifically, this is a price level equation, so, and as you go through in the paper, there's a lot of stickiness at that point, so perhaps there's a lot of persistence there as well. So I was thinking about how robust are the results if you throw in like the first lag of the price. This is dynamic, obviously, then you need to try to do some dynamic panel estimation to take into account the potential persistence and particularly the stickiness of that price. I would like to see how this coefficient kind of survives to apply that. But then, even more so, you can think about forward-lookingness in terms of the price setting behavior, how you set a price. Typically, and you do it in the paper. You add some inflation expectation from professional, trying to kind of get a sense of how important is the forward-looking channel in terms of the price setting. But I would keep thinking about what would you really care about here is how you expect your marginal cost will change in the future. This is like typical the micro level supply curve you want, and how important is this variable in terms of how you set a price today. There's a very important reference, which is Carlson and Scans in the EAR 2012, sorry, that actually uses this data from Swedish. I don't know if you know this paper, and actually they run a very similar regression as you guys did, but the control for the future firm level, future expected cost. So I went through the paper looking for this reference and I couldn't find it. So I don't know if you know familiar with that paper. That paper is more in the expectation formation, information asymmetries kind of literature, but still it's very connected to. I think it's very highly connected to your results. That's for comment 1. Comment 2, I cannot stop thinking about, well, you do have this very important granular data. What if you just estimate the supply curve at the sectoral level? There's lots of evidence that this really matters for the transmission of shocks. You got the Lisa Rubo paper showing that, well, all these input-output linkages actually flatten the supply, the sectoral Phillips curve. And this is, then you can map this and link it to the centrality of the sector. So if you start estimating this at the industry level, you can claim, well, perhaps some specific industry is more connected to other firms, and you can speak to this little about the transmission of shocks. That's one thing. And the other thing is that, well, perhaps there's, as we know, there's lots of evidence also about heterogeneity in price stickiness across sectors, as I show also. That can be directly mapped to this if you estimated this at the industry level. Again, trying to study whether the monetary policy shocks will affect the economy differently through the different impacts on the different sectors. For me, you can just with such a great data, you can do it, and you can immediately start kind of talking to this specific literature, which is very popular lately. And my third and final comment is about, well, what you didn't mention much, but it's more about this financial volatility. According to the result, the supply curve flattens during episodes of high volatility and financial volatility episodes. Myself, I cannot really think about what is volatility, is uncertainty, what is driving the results. But then I keep thinking about how to make sense this through a model. So if you look at the very canonical SS model with the menu cost, then you will have that high volatility, whatever volatility that is, idiosyncratic, financial, or whatever. The implication is that is going to widen the inaction region, and then you got the typical trade-off, meaning that, well, if you get a wider inaction region, which effect dominates? The wait and see effect, which is the option value of weighting, related to the volatility effect. The empirical literature has been claiming that the volatility effect usually dominates. That's why you get, during episodes of high volatility, that the frequency of the price change. And actually, that frequency goes up. We have evidence at the macro level. This is Joe Babra and also Isaac Valleja and Andres Blanco has this result. At the macro level, we also have a result showing the same thing at the idiosyncratic level, so the business level volatility in the data. So for me, I know that you discussed this a little bit on the paper. So what is the mechanism that is driving this result in the financial volatility episodes? You claim that since this is a global demand shock, so the frequency, so the price goes down, as far as I remember in the paper, it would be nice to actually show that the frequency of downward price adjustment significantly dropped during this financial uncertainty, trying to make sense to do all this kind of the more theoretical literature in these matters. And then if prices are really changing more often, then why the supply curve is getting more flatter? What is the mechanism that is driving this result? I keep thinking, I know that you referred to Simon Gilchrist and co-authors paper, but still, through the lens of this SS model, I couldn't really make sense of this. And also, what is the specific feature about financial volatility that brings down the supply curve relative to what we know in the empirical part about the macro idiosyncratic volatility? So, but besides that, I don't have any further comments. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Xavier. I think those comments are very, very helpful. In terms of the persistence of the prices, I don't know if I understand it correctly, but in the baseline specification, we include lags of the own price. So I don't know if that was what you referred to. So we have lags of both prices and sales in the baseline. So in terms of inflation expectation, I think that's a really good point. I think this is something that you would ideally, try to control for at the firm level, really. Currently, we don't have access to, granular information on inflation expectations, so that's nothing we can include. We have the robustness check with the aggregate inflation expectations in the paper, which is robust, but of course you would ideally want to control for really the firm's own expectation. I think in terms of this marginal cost expectation, I think I'm well aware of the paper. I think it's a good suggestion. I have not thought about it, but that's something to consider for sure. So that's very nice. And I also think that the industry level, look at some characteristics at the industry level could be important. In the Swedish data, there are some issues, there are some challenges with actually using industry-level data, which is due to some changes in, standards of how to classify firms in industry. So, within our sample, I think these standards have changed like multiple times, and those changes are kind of drastic. So it's not easy, but of course you can do something there, and I think that could be highly interesting. And then. With regard to the last comment, which I think, basically what we've been working on for the past couple of months is to try to make sense of these financial uncertainty results, because we think that they are kind of surprising, as you say, as well, but we also think that they're interesting. So we have kind of tried, what we're currently working on is to try to make sense of these results in a more theoretical framework. And we have not considered a menu cost framework as you suggest here. What we have been thinking more about is that it's a story about, trying to gain market share, because when we separate between, when we have these estimates of high and low financial uncertainty, we can separate between also, financially constrained and unconstrained firms. So we have kind of a triple interaction there. And then we see actually big differences between the financially constrained and unconstrained. So we kind of have the idea that financial constraints at the firm level interacted with aggregate financial uncertainty, that it's something, within that drives it. But we still are not quite there to kind of present, our findings there. But that's what we're currently working on. But I think also, thinking about it in terms of a pricing or a menu cost model is for sure an interesting idea. So thanks a lot for these comments. I think they will be very helpful for us. Thanks.
Well, we have any questions from the audience? No? So let's end this session. I would like to thank you for coming and sharing your work. It's really a pleasure to receive you here. And we'll be rejoining tomorrow at 9 for the keynote speak of Professor McMahon. Okay?
Save me.